The kindness of John Harris and the shadow of prejudice. The sun had barely risen when John Harris, a 12-year-old boy with bright eyes and an even brighter spirit, stepped onto the front porch of his family's modest suburban home. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, the scent mixing with the warm, golden rays of morning light. His mother, Cynthia Harris, had already left for work at the hospital, leaving behind a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, along with a hastily written note. "Be safe, baby. Love you always." John smiled at the note before folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. He always kept his mother's notes, little pieces of love and encouragement that kept him strong. Their neighborhood was a quiet one, lined with well-manicured lawns, picket fences, and houses that all looked similar in design, but vastly different in the warmth of their inhabitants. The Harrises were one of the only black families on the street, and while most of their neighbors were friendly, a few still eyed them with suspicion, as if waiting for a reason to believe they didn't belong. John, however, had never let that bother him. He believed in kindness, and if there was one thing his mother had taught him, it was that being good to people, even those who didn't always return the favor, was the right thing to do. That morning, as he dragged the trash bin to the curb, he noticed his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, struggling with her garbage bags. Without hesitation, John ran over. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Johnson," he offered, reaching for the bags. "Oh, John, dear, you're such a godsend." Mrs. Johnson sighed with relief. "These old bones just don't work like they used to." John smiled and quickly placed the bags in the bin before rolling it to the curb alongside hers. "Anything else you need help with?" he asked. Mrs. Johnson patted his hand affectionately. "No, sweetheart. Your mother must be so proud of you." John's chest swelled with pride. He loved making his mother proud. But what John didn't notice was that someone was watching him. Across the street, behind lace curtains, Miss Martha Griffin sat in her old rocking chair, eyes narrowed as she observed John moving from house to house, helping neighbors with small tasks. Her lips thinned with disapproval. "That boy is always lurking," she thought, her wrinkled fingers tightening around the armrests of her chair. Miss Griffin was in her late 70s, and for as long as she had lived in the neighborhood, she had been a pillar of the local community. She prided herself on knowing everyone's business, and she took it upon herself to ensure that their once predominantly white neighborhood stayed respectable. And to her, John Harris did not belong. She watched as he chatted with Mrs. Johnson, his laughter ringing through the morning air. So polite, so helpful. It's an act. She had seen his type before. They start off friendly, nice, polite, always lending a hand. And then, before you know it, crime starts creeping in. Things start going missing. People feel unsafe in their own homes. It had already begun, she was convinced. Just last month, her garden shears had gone missing. Coincidence? She didn't think so. He's up to something. I just need proof. And so Miss Griffin started watching John more closely. She noted every move he made, when he left the house, where he went, who he spoke to. She even started writing things down. Times, dates, incidents, a misplaced package on someone's porch. Suspicious. A neighbor's car left unlocked one night. Suspicious. And now, this morning, she saw John handling Mrs. Johnson's trash. Probably snooping, looking for something valuable. Miss Griffin had convinced herself that John Harris was a threat, and she had made up her mind. She was going to do something about it. A neighbor turns dangerous. That afternoon, John went about his usual routine. He played basketball with a few kids at the park, helped Miss Thompson with her groceries, and later spent time doing his homework at the dining table while waiting for his mother to return. But across the street, Miss Griffin was planning something far more sinister. She paced her living room, her frail hands trembling as she picked up the phone. Ring, ring, ring. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah." Miss Griffin swallowed, her mouth dry. I need something. The man on the other end of the line chuckled. "Lady, I don't take orders from old women. What do you want?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Drugs. I need to buy drugs." A pause. Then another chuckle. "Well, well, didn't expect that from you. What kind?" Miss Griffin didn't know. She didn't care. "Something that looks bad." "Real bad," she muttered. "Enough to get someone in trouble." There was a long silence. Then, "You got the money." Miss Griffin hesitated, but then nodded to herself. "This is for the good of the neighborhood. I'm doing the right thing." "Yes," she said, "I have the money. An act that will change everything." The next day, John went to help Miss Thompson again, carrying her groceries into the house. He left his backpack on the porch, as he always did. And that was when Miss Griffin made her move. Her heart pounded as she glanced around. No one was watching. Her wrinkled fingers trembled as she unzipped the side pocket of John's backpack and slipped the small bag of white powder inside. She zipped it shut and hurried away, her breathing ragged. Her pulse raced, and for a moment she felt a pang of guilt. But then she reminded herself, "I'm protecting my neighborhood." She hurried back inside, wiped her sweaty hands on her apron, and picked up the phone. Dialed. Waited. And then, when the dispatcher answered, she took a deep breath and said the words that would send an innocent boy's life spiraling into chaos. "There's a boy in our neighborhood," she said in a calm but trembling voice, "and I just saw him with drugs. His name is John Harris, and he lives at 1423 Maple Street." The arrest that shook the neighborhood. The warm glow of the evening sun bathed 1423 Maple Street in gold as John Harris sat at the dining table, finishing up his last few math problems. The smell of his mother's home-cooked chicken and rice filled the air, making his stomach rumble in anticipation. His mother, Cynthia Harris, was humming softly in the kitchen, her voice blending with the sounds of sizzling onions and bubbling sauce. "Mom, can we watch a movie after dinner?" John called out, stretching his arms after completing the final equation in his notebook. "Of course, baby," she replied, stirring the pot. "As long as it's not that superhero one you've seen 10 times already." John chuckled, shaking his head. "Fine. I'll find something else." Everything felt normal. Everything was peaceful. Until it wasn't. A sudden knock on the door made both of them freeze. It wasn't a polite knock. It was loud, sharp, urgent. A chill ran down John's spine. His mother wiped her hands on a towel and moved toward the door, hesitating for a moment before opening it. As soon as she did, 3 police officers stood on their porch, serious, tense, and unsmiling. "Ma'am, we need to speak with your son." A mother's worst nightmare. Cynthia Harris's heart pounded in her chest as she took in the sight before her. 2 police cruisers were parked outside, their flashing red and blue lights painting eerie reflections across the windows. A few neighbors stood on their porches, watching, whispering. Her grip on the door tightened. "What's going on? Why are you here?" The officer in front, a tall man with a hard stare, held up a small notepad. "We received an anonymous tip about illegal substances in this residence," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to conduct a search." John's stomach dropped. Cynthia stiffened. "What? Illegal substances? In my home? That's ridiculous." "We have reason to believe your son is in possession of illegal narcotics," the officer continued, shifting his gaze to John. "We need to check his belongings." John's blood ran cold. "That's a lie," he blurted out, panic setting in. "I don't have anything like that. I swear." Cynthia turned to her son, searching his face. She knew her child. John was a good boy. He was honest. He was kind. There was no way this could be true. But the officers weren't waiting for her approval. One of them stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need to see his backpack." John's backpack sat by the front door, just where he had left it after coming home from Miss Thompson's house. One of the officers picked it up, unzipped the side pocket, and reached inside. And then, Silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls, against their chests. The officer slowly pulled out a small plastic bag filled with white powder. For a moment, the world stopped moving. Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror. John felt his legs go weak. The officer turned the bag over in his gloved hand, his expression unreadable. Then he looked straight at John. "You want to explain this, son?" John's heart pounded against his ribs as he stared at the bag in disbelief. "That's not mine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know where that came from. I swear." But the officers didn't hesitate. "John Harris, you're under arrest for possession of illegal narcotics." And before he could even process what was happening, cold steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. The unthinkable happens. "No," Cynthia screamed, grabbing onto her son as they tried to pull him away. "This is a mistake. My son would never do this. He's a child." John struggled, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Mom, I didn't do anything. Please, tell them." Cynthia turned to the officers, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "You listen to me. You are not taking my baby. You have no proof." One of the officers held up the bag of drugs, his expression grim. "This is proof." The words hit like a sledgehammer. John's vision blurred with tears as he was dragged toward the door. The neighbors, watching from their porches, from their windows, whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded knowingly, as if they had always expected something like this. Miss Thompson, the elderly woman John had helped that very day, pushed through the crowd, her voice shaking. "You can't do this. He's a good boy. He helps me all the time." But other voices murmured doubt. "You never really know someone, do you? Such a shame. His mother always seemed nice, too." And through it all, from behind her lace curtains, Miss Griffin watched. She watched as John was shoved into the back of the police car. She watched as Cynthia Harris fell to her knees on the porch, screaming in anguish. And for the first time, she felt something unsettling. Regret. A child in chains. John sat in the back of the police car, his wrists burning from the tight cuffs. Tears streamed down his face, but he held back the sobs that threatened to escape. He was scared. More scared than he had ever been in his life. He thought of his mother, alone in the house, crying. He thought of Miss Thompson, of the neighbors who had once smiled at him, but now looked at him like a criminal. He thought of how everything had changed in an instant. And then he thought of one thing, one terrible truth that made his stomach twist into knots. Whoever had done this to him had planned it. Someone had planted those drugs. Someone had wanted him to go down for this. And John was determined to find out who. Trapped in the system. The cold steel cuffs around John Harris' wrists felt heavier than his worst nightmare. The hard plastic seat of the police car dug into his back as the officer driving barely spared him a glance. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off houses and parked cars. His neighbors were watching. Some peered through their curtains, whispering. Others stood outside, arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. John felt sick. His whole life, he had done everything right. He got good grades. He helped his neighbors. He never caused trouble. And now, in the blink of an eye, his world had flipped upside down. He glanced at the officer in the front seat. "Please, you have to believe me. I swear, I've never seen those drugs before." The officer didn't even turn his head. "You can tell that to the detective, kid." John's stomach twisted into knots. His mother's screams echoed in his ears, the sound of her breaking as they dragged him away. His hands balled into fists, the cuffs digging into his skin. He had never felt so powerless in his life. A mother's desperation. Cynthia Harris stood frozen on the front porch, her body trembling with rage and despair. Her child, her baby, was being taken away. She wanted to run after them, to tear those officers apart, to pull John from that car, and never let go. But she couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. Her breath came in sharp gasps. And all around her, the neighborhood whispered. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly neighbor John always helped, had tears in her eyes. Cynthia, you have to fight this. You have to get him back. Miss Thompson, still in disbelief, shook her head. I can't believe this is happening. This is wrong. This is so wrong. But others, some just stared. Some whispered behind their hands. And then there was Miss Griffin, standing behind her lace curtains, her fingers gripping the fabric tightly. She watched as Cynthia crumpled to her knees. She watched as the woman let out a cry of pure agony. And something in her twisted. Regret. No, not yet. This is for the best, she told herself, clutching her robe. He was always snooping, always poking around. I did what I had to do. But then, why did she feel like she had just ripped apart a family? Inside the police station, John was led into the cold, gray walls of the police station, his feet shuffling against the tile floor. The officers barely spoke to him. They walked him past rows of desks, where detectives sat working on real cases with actual criminals. Eyes flickered toward him. Some looked bored. Some looked suspicious. Some didn't look at him at all. John swallowed the lump in his throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. They led him down a long hallway and into a small interrogation room, the kind he had only ever seen in TV shows. The walls were bare. The metal table in the center reflected the flickering light above. A chair sat across from him, empty. They pushed him into the other seat and uncuffed him. But his wrists still burned where the metal had dug into his skin. Wait here, one of the officers said, before leaving the room. The door shut with a click. And just like that, John was alone. A battle for the truth. Cynthia Harris didn't waste a second. As soon as the police car drove away, she grabbed her phone and dialed the one person who could help. Robert Bennett, a sharp, no-nonsense defense attorney. He had once been a close friend of her late husband. He had fought and won cases for people who had been falsely accused. And now, her son needed him more than ever. Robert, they took him. They took John. There was a pause. Then, I'm on my way. Cynthia barely had time to breathe before another thought hit her. The security cameras. She grabbed her keys and ran across the street to Mr. Johnson's house, nearly pounding on the door. The elderly man opened it, surprised. Mr. Johnson, your camera. The one on your front porch. I need the footage from today. Please, it might save my son's life. Mr. Johnson's face darkened. He nodded. Come inside. Let's pull it up. The interrogation begins. The door opened. John jumped slightly as a detective walked in, his heavy boots echoing against the floor. He was a tall man, built like a soldier, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through him. He sat down across from John, opening a folder and flipping through a few pages. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, John. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Do you know why you're here? John licked his lips. His mouth felt dry. I didn't do anything. The detective sighed, pushing the plastic bag of drugs across the table. This was found in your backpack. John stared at it, his stomach turning. I don't know how it got there. I swear. The detective leaned forward, clasping his hands together. John, he said, voice firm, if you're honest with me, I can help you. But you have to tell me the truth. Who gave you these drugs? No one. John's voice rose in panic. I don't know anything about that. Someone put them there. The detective's expression remained unreadable. I want to believe you, he said slowly, but the evidence says otherwise. John's hands clenched into fists. It was happening. They weren't going to believe him. No matter what he said. A break in the case. Got it. Mr. Johnson clicked on the security camera footage and rewound the tape. Cynthia held her breath, watching the screen. The footage was clear. At 3:46 p.m., John had set his backpack down on Miss Thompson's porch. At 3:49 p.m., a figure stepped into the frame. Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. A frail, hunched figure with gray hair, looking over her shoulder nervously. Miss Griffin. Miss Griffin. She bent over John's backpack, unzipped a pocket, and reached inside her coat. Cynthia gripped the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles turned white. She saw it. Miss Griffin pulled out a small plastic bag of white powder, identical to the one in the police report, and tucked it inside John's bag. Her hands were shaking as she zipped it up and hurried away. Cynthia stared at the screen, her entire body frozen. And then, her rage exploded. That man. She shot to her feet, her entire body shaking. Mr. Johnson sat back, his face grim. "That's it," he muttered. "That's your proof." Cynthia turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Send it to me," she said. Her voice was deadly calm. "I'm getting my son out of there. And I'm going to make that woman pay." The truth comes crashing down. A mother on a mission. The moment Cynthia Harris had the security footage on her phone, she didn't waste a second. She barely remembered grabbing her keys, barely noticed the sharp evening air biting at her skin as she rushed to her car, hands trembling with fury and urgency. "Hold on, baby. Mama's coming." She didn't care that she was speeding. Didn't care that her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Didn't care that her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out every other sound. She had proof. Undeniable, irrefutable, damning proof. Her baby was innocent, and she was going to burn the world down before she let them take him away. Inside the interrogation room, John sat stiffly in his chair, his nails digging into his palms. The detective across from him sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You're making this harder on yourself, kid." John's jaw clenched. "I didn't do anything." The detective flipped through a few pages of his case file, clicking his tongue. "Your record is clean. Good grades. No history of trouble. But that doesn't mean you didn't get mixed up in something." John felt his stomach churn. They weren't listening. No matter what he said, no matter how many times he swore he was innocent, they didn't believe him. His breathing turned shallow. This was how it happened, wasn't it? This was how kids like him got buried in the system. He wasn't even old enough to drive, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. His hands shook as he clenched them into fists beneath the table. He felt a storm rising inside him. Anger, fear, hopelessness. And then, the door burst open. The storm hits the station. "Get your hands off my son." Cynthia's voice echoed through the station like a gunshot. Detectives, officers, and clerks turned their heads in shock as she stormed inside, her phone gripped so tightly it might shatter. Her heels clicked against the floor like warning shots, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and raw, unfiltered desperation. At the front desk, a young officer stood up nervously. "Ma'am, you can't just." Cynthia slammed her phone down on the counter, pressing play. The video played, and silence fell over the room. Every eye in the station was glued to the screen. There, as clear as day, was Miss Griffin, the sweet old lady from down the street, bending over John's backpack and stuffing a bag of white powder inside. There was no doubt, no mistaking it, no misinterpreting what was happening. Cynthia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You arrested my son. You humiliated him. You let this neighborhood think he was a criminal. And you didn't even do your damn job." The detective handling John's case went pale. Cynthia snatched up her phone and pointed a trembling finger straight at him. "Let my son go now." The police chief had heard the commotion from his office. He came out, a deep frown on his face. "What the hell is going on out here?" One of the officers wordlessly handed him the phone. The moment the chief saw the footage, his face turned to stone. Justice finally wakes up. John sat frozen as the detective in front of him got a call on his radio. He listened, his face drained of color. Then, with a sharp exhale, he stood up and unlocked John's cuffs. John rubbed his sore wrists, blinking in shock. "Your mom's here," the detective muttered. John didn't need to be told twice. The moment the door opened, he practically sprinted out. And there, in the middle of the police station, was his mother. Cynthia turned, eyes brimming with tears, and threw her arms around her son. John melted into her embrace, burying his face against her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." John couldn't even speak. He just held on to her, letting the tears finally fall. And as he did, one thought burned in his mind. Miss Griffin was going to pay for this. A knock at Miss Griffin's door. Across town, Miss Griffin sat in her dimly lit living room, hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. Her hands shook. She had spent all evening trying to convince herself she had done the right thing. That John deserved this. That she had protected the neighborhood. But deep down, guilt clawed at her chest, like a wild animal. She hadn't been able to sleep. And then, there was a knock at the door. A sharp, heavy, unforgiving knock. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She knew before she even opened the door. And when she did, there they were. 3 police officers standing on her porch, their faces hard as stone. "Miss Griffin, you need to come with us." Miss Griffin stared at them, speechless. Her legs wobbled. Her lip quivered. "Do you what?" she whispered, voice weak. The officers didn't explain. One simply stepped forward and placed her in handcuffs. And just like that, the woman who had called the police on John Harris was being arrested herself. The neighborhood watches again, just like before. Flashing red and blue lit up the street. Just like before, neighbors gathered outside. Just like before, someone was being led into a police car in handcuffs. But this time, it wasn't John Harris. This time, it was Miss Martha Griffin. And this time, no one defended her. Mrs. Johnson stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, shaking her head in disgust. Miss Thompson wiped a tear away, whispering, "She did this to herself." Even the ones who had once agreed with her, who had once whispered that John must have been guilty, now stood with tight lips and shame in their eyes. Because they had been wrong. And they had let it happen. From their own porch, Cynthia and John watched it unfold. John felt nothing as Miss Griffin was placed in the back of the police car. No pity, no forgiveness, just cold, heavy exhaustion. His mother, however, reached for his hand and squeezed it. "You're free, baby. You're free." And for the first time in hours, John let himself believe it. A reckoning at Maple Street. The neighborhood watches in shock. As the police car doors slammed shut behind Miss Griffin, the weight of the moment settled over the entire street. Neighbors stood frozen, their faces reflecting a mix of emotions, shock, disbelief, and for some, a quiet, simmering guilt. No one had expected this. Miss Griffin, the same woman who had organized neighborhood bake sales, prided herself on keeping the lawns pristine, and gossiped with other elderly ladies about the good old days, was now being driven away in handcuffs. For so long, she had painted herself as the guardian of the community, the one who looked out for the neighborhood. But now, that carefully built reputation was shattering into dust. And in the middle of it all stood John Harris, the boy she had tried to ruin. John stood on the porch beside his mother, watching silently, watching as justice unfolded. His hands clenched at his sides, his breathing even. But inside, a storm raged. This should have felt like victory. But all he felt was emptiness. The whispers began again. "She really did it." Someone muttered. "I can't believe it," another whispered. "She was always talking about keeping the neighborhood safe." A man in a suit, who lived 3 houses down, shook his head. All the talk about troublemakers and bad elements, and it turns out she was the real criminal. Miss Thompson, the elderly woman John had helped earlier that very day, wiped a shaky hand over her face. I should have said something. She wasn't the only one who felt that way. Because suddenly, everyone was remembering all the subtle, quiet ways Miss Griffin had treated the Harris family differently. The way she never spoke directly to Cynthia, even when standing right next to her. The way she always stiffened when John walked by, clutching her purse a little tighter, locking her doors a little quicker. The way she had always hinted that people like them didn't belong in the neighborhood. And now they had let this happen. Because while Miss Griffin planted the drugs, she hadn't acted alone. She had been fed by their silence, their complacency, and that silence had almost cost a 12-year-old boy his future. A mother's words cut deep. As the police car turned the corner, Cynthia Harris took a deep, steadying breath. Then she turned, faced them all. Her neighbors, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had watched as her son was dragged away, the ones who had assumed the worst. Her voice was calm, but her words cut like a blade. I want you all to remember this moment. She scanned their faces, holding their gazes one by one. I want you to remember how quick you were to believe a little black boy was guilty, even though he had done nothing but be kind to every single one of you. Some looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke, because what could they say? How do you argue against the truth? John swallowed hard. His mother's words felt heavy in his chest. They had spent years in this neighborhood, years trying to be model neighbors, years proving they belonged. And in a single night, all of that had been ripped away. His trust in these people, gone. Miss Griffin's long night. As the police station loomed ahead, Miss Griffin sat stiffly in the back seat, her fingers trembling against her lap. Her mind raced. This was a mistake. This was going too far. Please, I just made an error in judgment, she croaked, her voice unsteady. I didn't mean for things to go this far. The officer in the front seat didn't respond. Miss Griffin's stomach twisted. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, she muttered, as if trying to convince herself more than them. No response. Just the steady hum of the engine. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, reality slammed into her like a freight train. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't going to go away overnight. She was about to face real consequences for the first time in her life. Her hands shook violently. Because she knew. This wasn't just about the drugs. This was about who she had been her entire life. And now, she was finally being held accountable. A mother's embrace. Back on Maple Street, John felt his knees go weak as everything caught up to him. The weight of what had just happened. The fear. The rage. The realization that, if not for that security footage, he could have been lost forever. Before he could stop himself, his whole body trembled. And in an instant, his mother's arms were around him, strong and steady. You're home, baby. You're safe. But John didn't feel safe. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. The community at a crossroads. That night, Maple Street was quieter than it had ever been. The same neighborhood that had whispered and judged was now grappling with its own guilt. Some neighbors sat in their living rooms, staring at their walls, ashamed. Others avoided the topic entirely, pretending nothing had happened. But there was no erasing what they had seen. Because what do you do when your neighborhood turns against a child? What do you do when you were part of the problem? No one had an answer. And no one could ignore the uncomfortable truth. They had let it happen. And now, they had to figure out how to fix what had been broken. If they even could. The trial that shook Maple Street. A boy forever changed. The world didn't go back to normal. Not for John Harris. Not for his mother, Cynthia. Not for the neighborhood that had betrayed him. And definitely not for Miss Griffin, who now sat behind bars, waiting for her day in court. For the first few days after his release, John barely left the house. The warmth of his home, the one place he had always felt safe, now felt like a cage. He would sit by the window, watching the street that once felt like his own, but now seemed like a place full of strangers. He saw his neighbors walking by, whispering. Some of them would glance toward his house with guilt in their eyes, like they wanted to say something. But none of them knocked on the door. None of them apologized. And John, he wasn't sure if he would ever forgive them. Cynthia Harris refuses to let this go. Cynthia had spent years building a home in this neighborhood. She had smiled through the microaggressions, through the awkward pauses when she introduced herself, through the thinly veiled concerns about crime and property values the moment she moved in. She had told herself, they'll come around. But when they had a chance to stand up for her son, they didn't. Now, as she stood in her kitchen, hands gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold, she made herself a promise. She would never let this happen again, and she was going to make sure Miss Griffin paid for what she had done. Not just for John, for every child who had ever been falsely accused, for every black family who had ever been made to feel like outsiders in their own home. She picked up her phone and called Robert Bennett, their lawyer. We're pushing for the maximum sentence. There was no hesitation in her voice. I don't want a plea deal. I don't want an apology. I want her to pay. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, I understand. We'll make sure she doesn't walk away from this. The trial begins. The courtroom was packed. Reporters had gotten wind of the case, an elderly white woman framing a 12-year-old black boy for a crime he didn't commit. It was headline news. Cameras flashed as Cynthia and John walked into the courthouse, flanked by their lawyer. John felt like he was in a dream, like none of this could possibly be real. His hands trembled as he clutched his mother's hand. The weight of so many eyes on him made his skin crawl. Stay strong, baby, Cynthia whispered, squeezing his hand. John nodded, swallowing hard. Then he looked toward the defendant's table. And there she was, Miss Griffin. She looked different. Gone was the confident, nosy neighbor who had always peered at him with thinly veiled contempt. Instead, she looked small, fragile. Her wrists were bound in cuffs, her once neatly styled hair disheveled. Her hand shook as she wiped her eyes with a tissue. She looked at John once, then quickly looked away. And John, he felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, just emptiness. The prosecution strikes first. Robert Bennett did not hold back. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady, commanding. What we have here is not just a case of false accusations. This is a case of prejudice, deception, and a calculated attempt to ruin the life of a child. He stepped toward the jury, his gaze piercing. We have video evidence showing Miss Griffin planting drugs in John Harris' backpack. We have proof that she called the police with a false report. We have testimony from neighbors who witnessed her behavior, who will tell you exactly what she thought of John and his family. He turned toward Miss Griffin. What we don't have, he said, voice dripping with disgust, is any explanation for why an innocent child was handcuffed in front of his home, dragged to jail, and interrogated like a criminal. Miss Griffin's shoulders sagged. John watched as her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. They knew. There was no defense for this. Miss Griffin tries to explain. When it was her turn to speak, Miss Griffin's voice cracked. I was afraid. She wrung her hands together, avoiding everyone's gaze. I saw him always walking around, always going to different houses. I thought. She choked on her words. I thought he was up to something. There was a sharp intake of breath from the audience. The judge's eyes darkened. Miss Griffin kept talking. I let my fear take over, she whispered. I convinced myself he was a danger to the neighborhood. I made a terrible mistake. She looked at John now, her eyes pleading. I'm sorry. But John, he just stared at her, expression blank. Sorry. She had tried to destroy his life. And now, because she got caught, she was sorry. His fingers curled into fists under the table. But he said nothing. Because he didn't owe her a single word. The verdict. The jury didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, they returned. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Martha Griffin, you have been found guilty on all charges." A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge continued. "You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation." A single cry rang out from the defendant's table, Miss Griffin's sister, who had come to support her. But Miss Griffin, she just nodded, her face pale. She had known this was coming. And as she was led away, John felt that emptiness again. Nothing had been undone. No sentence, no verdict, no punishment could ever erase what had happened. But at least she was gone. At least she would never hurt anyone else again. Can you ever forgive? That night, John sat outside on his porch, staring at the sky. His mother came out, sitting beside him. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, she asked for forgiveness. John let out a slow breath. "I know." His mother turned to him. "Do you think you'll ever give it to her?" John was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, "I don't know. And for now." That was enough. Because forgiveness isn't something you owe. It's something you choose. And John, he wasn't ready yet. Maybe he never would be. And that was okay. Because some things shouldn't be so easily forgiven. A new dawn, a broken neighborhood, the aftermath of a storm. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of Miss Griffin's guilty verdict still hung heavy in the air. John Harris sat still, staring at the now empty defendant's table. It was over. Miss Griffin had been led away, her sentence decided. 3 years in prison, 5 years of probation. She was gone. But as John sat there, a thought curled itself deep in his mind. Why didn't it feel like a victory? The neighborhood that turned on him. Back on Maple Street, nothing felt the same. People still whispered, but not the way they had before. Now, it wasn't about him. It was about themselves. It was about their guilt. John could see it in the way some neighbors avoided his eyes, their heads ducked in shame when he walked past. He saw it in the way some tried too hard to be nice now, offering polite waves, awkward smiles, and nervous small talk at the mailbox. Some had even brought over casseroles and baked goods, as if that would erase what they had done. Miss Thompson, who had always been kind, had sat across from him one afternoon, wringing her hands. "I should have said something sooner, John." John just stared at his plate, feeling tired. She wasn't wrong. But what was he supposed to say? That it was okay. Because it wasn't. And deep down, they all knew it. The unexpected visitor. One rainy afternoon, a week after the trial, John sat on the porch, watching as the rain drizzled over the street. His mother was inside, making tea. And then a car pulled up. A dark, unfamiliar sit-in. John watched as the passenger door opened, and for a moment, he couldn't believe his eyes. A frail figure stepped out, her hands clutching a folded umbrella. Miss Griffin's sister. John's chest tightened. He hadn't seen her much before the trial, but he remembered how she had wept when the verdict was read. She stood there for a long moment, hesitating, before finally walking toward the porch. John didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. Finally, she cleared her throat. "John, I know you probably don't want to see me, and I understand if you don't want to hear what I have to say." Her voice was soft, heavy with something painful. John clenched his jaw, but nodded once. She took a breath, gathering herself. "Martha, Miss Griffin, she wrote something for you." John felt his whole body go stiff. "She asked me to give it to you. But if you don't want it, I won't force it on you." John's heart pounded. Did he want it? A letter. From her. The woman who had tried to ruin his life. But something inside him needed to know. So slowly, hesitantly, he reached out. And took it. Miss Griffin's letter. John waited until later that night to open it. He sat on his bed, the dim glow of his bedside lamp casting soft shadows across his room. His hands shook as he unfolded the paper. Then he began to read. John, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I don't deserve it. I have spent the past few weeks in a jail cell, alone with my thoughts. And the more I think, the more I realize I was wrong. Not just about what I did to you, but about everything. About how I saw the world. About how I saw you. I convinced myself that I was protecting my neighborhood, that I was keeping people like me safe. But safe from what? A boy who helped his neighbors. A boy who carried groceries and mowed lawns and smiled at old women who didn't deserve his kindness. No, I wasn't protecting the neighborhood. I was protecting my ignorance. And for that, I have no excuse. I ruined your trust. I stole your peace, and I will live with that for the rest of my life. I don't expect your forgiveness, John, but I needed you to know that I see you now. I see what I did, and I am sorry. Martha Griffin. John stared at the letter for a long, long time. He should have felt satisfaction, maybe even relief. Instead, he just felt tired. He folded the letter and placed it inside his nightstand drawer. His mother knocked softly on the door. Baby, you okay? John took a slow breath. Then he nodded. Yeah, Mom, I'm okay. And for the first time in weeks. Maybe he actually meant it. A new beginning. Miss Griffin was gone, but the scars she left behind, they would take a long time to heal. John didn't know if he would ever trust this neighborhood again. He didn't know if he would ever see these people the same way. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this define him. He wasn't going to let it break him. And maybe, just maybe, one day, when he was ready, he'd figure out what forgiveness really meant. But for now, he would just keep moving forward, because he was more than what happened to him. He was John Harris, and no one would ever take that away from him again. Healing takes time. A community trying to move forward. The weeks after Miss Griffin's conviction felt like a strange, uncomfortable silence settling over Maple Street. People still mowed their lawns, still watered their flowers, still waved politely to one another. But something had changed. There was no more pretending. No more turning a blind eye. John felt it every time he walked to school, every time he stepped outside, every time he rode his bike past houses that once felt familiar. The neighborhood wasn't the same. And neither was he. An unexpected apology. One Saturday morning, while John sat on the porch, a familiar voice called his name. He looked up. Mrs. Thompson stood at the edge of their driveway, wringing her hands. She looked nervous. John glanced at his mother, who was standing in the doorway. Cynthia's expression was unreadable, but she didn't move to stop Mrs. Thompson. So John just sat there, waiting. Finally, the old woman cleared her throat. John, I came to say I'm sorry. John stiffened. Mrs. Thompson had always been nice to him. She had always smiled and thanked him when he helped her with her groceries. But when the police had taken him away when he had needed her the most, she had stood silent. John said nothing. Mrs. Thompson sighed. I didn't know what to say, John. I knew it wasn't true, but I let myself be scared. I let myself doubt you. She swallowed hard. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. John felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say, it's okay. But it wasn't. So instead he said, I don't know if I can forgive you. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. I understand. She turned to go, but then stopped. If you ever need anything at all, you just knock on my door, okay? I know I don't deserve it, but I want to be better. John didn't say anything, and she didn't wait for a response. She just walked away, facing the neighborhood. John wasn't the only one who got apologies. One by one, people started showing up at their door. Some with words, some with guilt, some with baked goods as if cookies could erase the past. John listened, but he didn't answer right away. Because how could he forgive people who had watched it happen? Who had let it happen? The worst part, some neighbors never apologized at all. Some people just wanted to forget, to move on, like nothing had ever happened. But John Harris would never forget. The last letter from Miss Griffin. 3 months after the trial, another letter arrived in the mail. From prison. John hesitated before opening it. His mother sat beside him at the kitchen table, ready to take it away if he didn't want to read it. But John needed to know. So he unfolded the paper and began to read. John, this is the last time I will write to you. I don't expect you to respond. I just wanted to say that I have started to learn. In this place, I have met people who have been judged unfairly, like you were. I see the system for what it is now. I see how easy it is to be on the wrong side of it. And I think about you, John. I think about how I took away your sense of safety. I think about how you must feel walking through a neighborhood that failed you. I think about how I nearly destroyed you, and I hate myself for it. I know my apology will never be enough. I know my regret means nothing to you. But I had to write this, because even if I can never undo the past, I wanted you to know. You deserved better, and I am sorry. Martha Griffin. John exhaled slowly, setting the letter down. His mother watched him carefully. How do you feel? She asked gently. John shrugged. I don't know. And that was the truth. Maybe one day he'd forgive her. Maybe one day he'd let it go. But today, he just folded the letter up and put it away. Because some wounds take time to heal. Moving forward, life didn't go back to normal. John didn't magically trust his neighbors again. His mother didn't pretend everything was okay. But they kept living. They kept pushing forward. John kept helping Miss Johnson with her trash. He kept visiting the community center after school. And slowly, he found himself smiling again, laughing again, feeling normal again. The pain would always be there. The memories would never fully leave. But John was more than what had happened to him. He was more than Miss Griffin's crime. And as he rode his bike down the street, feeling the wind rush against his face, he realized something. She had tried to destroy him, but he had survived. And that was something she could never take away.